Hi, everybody. Welcome. Most of you know me, Jeremy from the Honors Program, and I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's lecture in the Honors Art and Politics and Honors in BCS Art and Politics lecture series. This is our third lecture of the semester. We have one more coming up that I'll just point to now on Monday, December the 1st, after Thanksgiving. We have someone coming to speak whose father, I believe, was in an underground anti-Nazi organization called the Red Orchestra, and he's going to be speaking about kind of that organization and many artists who were involved in the German underground in the fascist period. Alas, not too irrelevant to thinking about the contemporary drift of international politics. So it should be very interesting. He's coming from Germany, so please stay tuned for that. In the meantime, tonight's lecture, the Art and Politics lecture series, the whole point is to think about the interstices of art and politics in the face of contemporary developments and contemporary crises of the climate, crises of democratic politics, crises of unemployment, crises of technological, runaway technology, and more. And to think about what aid art and resources art might give us in thinking about our times. Tonight, I'm so thrilled to do, and I will pass around a sign-up sheet, especially for the students here. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome our guest speaker and his fascinating lecture topic. I, alas, left my notes on his many accomplishments over there in my backpack and feel it's too awkward to go get them at this point. But I will say, I'm so pleased to welcome Luigi Ballerini, who is an accomplished essayist, poet, a translator who's published a mammoth volume of Italian poetry from Pasolini to the present quite recently, and has many other volumes to his credit that if I had the paper in front of me, I would say. But he is an accomplished writer, art critic, and poet and translator, and we really couldn't be luckier to have him here for his fascinating topic that I think will get us thinking in new ways about the history of art, especially relevant for the students in this room. So without further ado, let's please welcome Luigi Ballerini.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I will not mention any name, but you're all thanked. The question that prompted the research and eventually the publication of a book called Leonardo's Eels is the following. Did Leonardo know that the eels he painted on the table of his Last Supper are a food prohibited by Moses? In the Deuteronomy and in the Leviticus, it's quite clear that Jews are not supposed to eat fish that has no scales and no fins. If you take a good look at eels, you see that there are little scales and little fins, but in any case. Now, it's interesting to relate the fact that eels are a prohibited food and that the meal that we are going to talk about is Easter meal. And there's no doubt that Jesus and the apostles knew about the fact that they were going to celebrate Easter. And Matthew says, now the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? And all Gospels repeat more or less the same thing. So we are in the presence of a Jewish meal with a prohibited food. Now, we will have to establish whether Leonardo knew about it or not, and the answer, I can tell you right away, yes, he did. So we will figure out possibly why he did it. Okay. Now, before we do that, I'd like to show some material that will become handy when the speech continues, okay? You see, it took him 4 years to do the painting in the Santa Maria delle Grazie, the church in Milan. That's not because he was a lazy bone person, but it's because he was at the service of the Duke of Milan, Ludovico, who continually interrupted him. as a matter of fact, we know that it mostly is false because he jotted down a letter. We have the draft of a letter that he sent to Ludovico when he was trying to look for a job, and he has a long list of things that he can do, like armories, landmines, towers, hydraulic inventions, and at the end of it says, and by the way, I can also paint. And I'm second to no one in this business, he says. So when he began to paint in 1494, of course, you have to imagine that this was in a refectory, in a room, a rather long room where monks used to eat their meals, and he occupied it for 4 years. So after a while, the monks were not very happy with the idea. They had to move their lunches and dinners everywhere else in the convent because Leonardo was painting. And this comes up time and again in the literature. The Maestro Fiorentino, the Florentine master, is still painting. When will he finish? Etc. And there are many complaints to the Duke. He says, tell him to finish the damn job. We have to go back and eat and retrieve our refectory, and so on and so forth. But I want you to see, this is of course the most famous wall painting on earth. By the way, it's not a fresco, and that's one of the reasons why it deteriorated quickly. It's an oil painting. Leonardo had this incredible idea of making an oil painting on a wall, which was really a little crazy. As a matter of fact, after a few years after he finished the painting, it began to deteriorate. A sort of a foam developed on it. And Vasari, in his History of Italian Painting, says there is a dazzling stain on the surface of the Leonardo. So let's say from 1515 on, it's been a series of disasters. In 1943, I will skip them all, but in 1943, the building where the Last Supper is painted was bombed by the Royal Air Force when Milan was practically razed to the ground, and miraculously 2 walls stood. One of them had the Last Supper and one facing the crucifixion. All this is to say that what we now look at, what we now see when we go to Milan, it's about 30% of what Leonardo actually painted. Through the centuries, people have added, other people have removed, and nowadays they decided that it was better to have the 30% that was definitely by Leonardo rather than the 90% that was by somebody else. So by now, if you stand about 15 yards away from it, the eye compensates, and the last, I hope it's the last, certainly the latest restoration project was skillfully done in such a way that they did not reproduce missing parts, but they hinted at the color that those parts had. So for instance, if you have an arm that is red and it's interrupted, they continue with a few dots of red after in the missing section, and your eyes will imagine it to see the entire arm. It's a beautiful job, but we are not here to talk about that. We are to talk about the fact that some time ago, someone saw that there was a dish of eels on the table. Now, mind you that it's only 30 or 40 years that we look at food everywhere. Food has entered the cultural discourse in such a phenomenal way that we look for food elements everywhere. And of course, art history has been particularly ransacked. Objects of art have been ransacked by gastronomers looking for special food and special recipes, and what did Leonardo eat, and what did Napoleon eat, and what did Casanova eat, and what did George Washington drink, and so on and so forth. But it all goes through artwork, it goes through painting. So someone apparently, actually I know who it is, John Variano, in an article, he said there are eels on the table of the Last Supper, and he just put a dot there and didn't continue. So I began to reflect on his discovery and ask myself the question that I explicited before. Now, you look at this painting, this is the dance of Salome. I guess that's the way you pronounce it, right? It's embarrassing for an Italian because it sounds like salami, but in any case, you see King Herod and the dancer. In the left-hand side, you have St. John the Baptist who's been decapitated, but there's no food on the table, hardly any food. Now, this would be a perfect occasion for food to be shown because it's not a religious painting, right? It could have been an orgy, but there's no paint, there's no food, and it's very strange because a lot of religious paintings show a great deal of food. Sometimes in the 16th century, it's really orgies of food, and where it should have been, there's none. Now, another thing that I want you to focus on is the fact that the church here, we are in Santa Croce, and you can see the table of the Last Supper is part of a cycle. It's there's the tree of the Franciscan brothers and other episodes. That there's a cluster of images that the Last Supper is not autonomously painted, okay? But this is an important fact because after a while it does become autonomous. It becomes the thing that is portrayed in and of itself without nothing around it, okay? And this is, as you see, the table here is sparse. It is bread and wine, of course. You know, bread and wine is what the gospel talk about. It's what Christ does. He breaks the bread and says, "This is my body," and he gives the chalice of wine and says, "This is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." Okay. I will not go into the number of genocides that have occurred because of this formula, because some people decided that it was a symbolic, it's a metaphorical way of speaking, and somebody insisted that it was the real thing. That is to say that when you eat bread, the Holy Communion, you actually eat the body of Christ. Other people thought, no, that's a way of speaking. You know, it's as Christ said many strange things, like I'm the way, I'm the door, I'm the sky. It doesn't mean that he was actually the sky, the door, or the way. But when it comes to bread, it's bread in the appearance, but body in the substance. This is final, okay? If you don't believe it, you go to hell. Now, it's also interesting to see that this is a very famous, one of the most famous Last Suppers. If you go to Florence, don't miss it, okay? And you can see that somehow one of the characters that is rather important in the pictures of Last Supper, namely Judas, has acquired a rather handsome and rather dramatic stance. It forms, if you see the details there, you see Judas, Jesus, St. Peter, and the reclining young man, St. John, okay? But look how terrific that particular section is. There's a great deal of nobility, sort of a dark nobility if you want to, but usually Judas really cuts a very bad figure in all the Last Suppers. First of all, it's isolated. He's always on this side of the table, everyone else is on the other side. But not Leonardo, naturally. If you remember, we go back there, you see Judas is leaning on the table right here, in profil perdu, as they say, but it's on the same side as everyone else, okay? Whereas normally he's on the other side and is frequently caricatured. He's always stealing something. He's always holding on to his pouch with the 30 seconds and so on and so forth. But both Castagno and Leonardo have given him a rather dignified, you can say he's dignified in crime, but he's still dignified as a human being, okay? Now, go back to, this is 1306, so we are about almost 200 years before Leonardo. This is a Giotto painting, and you can see the table is practically naked. As I said, in the beginning, on all Last Suppers, you have either nothing or bread and wine. Okay, so it develops. It takes a little while before the actual food appears on the Last Supper, on the table of the Last Supper. Now, let me just go through all these images, that eventually, if we need, we come back to them. Okay, now this is an anonymous painting in a remote village in Abruzzo, and the only reason why I brought it to your attention is the fact that besides the apostles, there are two characters here that are sort of problematic. On the upper left hand side, you can see a man with a greenish hat. He's probably the person who paid for the painting, but right behind Jesus, that's Mary Magdalene. I mean, I wonder if Dan Brown ever went to Abruzzo and discovered that John, well, you know, the theory that John is not John, John is Mary Magdalene, but here the painter, we do not know his name, walked on safe ground. He said, I'm going to get John's place, but just in case, let me put in Mary Magdalene as well. And so, and here again, you have a rather sparse table. Judas, as you can see, is holding on to his money and is usually dressed in yellow. Yellow is the color of being a bad boy. Okay? So if you dress, beware. I mean, if you see someone dressed in yellow, just be careful of that. Okay. Right now. Having said that there's hardly any food on the table, before we go into real food, some painters begin to put in symbolic food. Okay, now, as you can see, this is Domenico Ghirlandaio, beautiful, a masterpiece. But there are cherries on the table. Cherries? Yes, because cherries are red, and red is the color of blood. And blood is what Christ shed for your salvation. So pretty soon, you know, it's called iconography. Warburg and company made a big deal out of it. If you see a dog, that's fidelity. If you see cherries, that's salvation. I don't know what you do when you see cucumbers, but that's all right. In any case, I want to stress the fact that slowly, before we get to food that we eat, we have on the table food that make us think. The food stands for something else. Okay. Now, as I said before, well, let me go through with the show because okay. Now, some got carried away here. Okay, this is no longer symbolic. This is Parmesan Reggiano. Now, obviously, in Palestine in year 33, I don't think anyone ever had an idea that Christ and the apostles would eventually eat Parmesan cheese, okay? But it's also at the time when cheese was for a long time regarded as a sort of a minor type of food. It was for poor people, for peasants. Lords and the aristocracy would not go anywhere near it. Okay? But someone said, hey, this is a great opportunity. If Christ eats it, then perhaps even the lords of Mantua, that's where the painting is, would start eating it, and then if he does eat it, it becomes a testimonial, and then everyone else will eat, and so on and so on. So actually, there's a moment we're talking about where this is very late, okay? This is 1600, late 1600. So, but I want you to understand that even in religious art, some smart aleck decided that it was exploitable for his own commercial purposes, okay? And this is possibly the most famous Last Supper painted by Veronese. It happens to be in Venice. And it used to be a Last Supper. It's no longer a Last Supper. It's called Dinner at the House of Levi. And you know why? That's simply because the Inquisitor took a look at it and said, where is Christ? And where are the apostles? And who's everyone else in there? And what are they doing? Well, I'll tell you what they were doing. This guy is actually picking his teeth. He's too much to eat. He must have had some meat in his between his molars. Then look at them. These people are wearing a turban. They're not Christian, they're Muslims. And what are those guys doing? Well, they are very expert connoisseur. They're tasting wine, you know. You're supposed to smell it before you gulp it down, right? So that's what they're doing. Now, can you imagine the reaction that the inquisitor had when they saw this painting? And they said, all right, we better call Veronese and have a chat with him. It's very interesting because in the 1900s, the transcripts of the trial were found, and you can see that the members of the Inquisition are speaking in Latin, though it's sort of a vulgar Latin. And he is actually, the painter is answering in Venetian dialect because that's the only language he knows. And they asked him, what prompted you to do all this? And he said, I'm a painter. You know, they gave me 17 or 20 yards of wall. What did you want me to do? I mean, I had to fill it, right? I mean, it's interesting because this exchange, you know, the Latin and the Venetian goes back and forth. In the end, they said, look, let's come to a compromise, scratch the title of Last Supper and put in the title Dinner at the House of Levi, which is actually what Veronese did, and that was the end of the story. Now, there's a long, long reason behind all this. Why would the Inquisition bother to attack Veronese, who was the number one painter in Venice at the time? There are political reasons. You know, Venice had first of all, there was a major battle, a sea battle between Christians and Muslims, the Battle of Lepanto. And Venice had contributed to that victory in a rather prominent way. But then, of course, they realized that having defeated the Turks meant absolutely nothing because they had all their business in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And if they wanted to reopen those places and places of business, they had to come to terms with the Turks. And in fact, that's what they did. They made a separate peace. Now, of course, the Pope was beside himself. Because I said, what do you mean? We just had a major war, we defeated the enemy, and you asked for forgiveness, and you asked them to permit you to go back. There was nothing else they could do. So Rome was infuriated, and stupidity is what you harm yourself without doing any good to the others, and so that's what they did. You know, they harmed they tried to harm in a very live manner Venice, which was an independent republic, and didn't accomplish anything anyway because the Venetians and the Turks continued trading, and as a matter of fact, even by putting Turkish people as members of the participants of the Last Supper. Now, this is another example of. This is Tintoretto, by the way, and it's a beautiful painting, except that you don't really know where Christ is in this Last Supper. Usually it takes place center place, and the apostles are on this side, but in this case, it's way back there. You know, what you see, in fact, on the foreground is a magnificent loaf of bread, not unleavened, I'm afraid. Okay. And it's a classic Venetian loaf of bread. Now, this is the time when the Republic of Venice, section northeast of the peninsula, was seriously considering switching over to John Calvin's form of Protestantism. There are many letters going back and forth between the British ambassador in Venice, and King James, the famous James Bible, saying they are ready. They will just turn Venice and the Venetian hinterland into a Protestant land. It did not occur, but they were really on the verge of saying enough with Rome, we move over because we cannot swallow the idea that when you eat the bread, you're actually eating the body of Christ. That's what Zwingli was saying, and John Calvin was saying, and Queen Elizabeth was saying. They were all heads of religion, like Queen Elizabeth too. Luther was uncertain. Okay, Luther said, well, in the moment when you actually bestow the benediction, it is the body, and afterward it stops being the body. But for this little trifle, many people died, okay? And I believe that Tintoretto, who painted 7 Last Suppers in Venice and 1 in Paris, in all of them as magnificent loaves of bread, say, hey, this is bread. Give me a break, okay? Now, we come to another contemporary painting. Actually, this is a chapel of the Sacred Mount of Varallo. And you can see that the apostles and Christ are having a feast of, this is no Olive Garden, this is a real thing. Now, there are fish because this place is on a beautiful trout fishing stream, and there's cheese and there's fruit, and if you really look carefully, you even see somebody coming in with a pie full of raspberries, and also on the, it's unfortunately not in this particular section, but there is even a slice of bacon. How un-Jewish could that be? You will let me know. Okay. Now you can see the fruit. And you will notice also that there is wait a minute, there's a sort of a lobster there. Okay, that's a late addition. Instead of there are no lobsters in Varallo Sesia, I can assure you. It's way up in the mountains. But there were crayfish. And obviously someone made a mistake and took off the crayfish and put in the lobster instead. But crayfish, also a forbidden food, are all over the Last Suppers. Where is it? Did I leave that out? I hope not. Oh, there you are. You see? These are all crayfish, all sparse on the table. And unfortunately, since they're not inside plates, they're on the tablecloth, all kinds of theories have emerged. Crayfish move backward. Apparently, that's what we think they do. I mean, they walk backward. And so someone said, that's a symbol of heresy, because they go away from the truth, from the religious truth. Someone said, that's a sort of a slur on Jews. There were persecution for a change, some persecution of Jews, and therefore the painter decided to unholify the Last Supper by putting crayfish on it. Exactly. I mean, the number of theories about it, it's incredible, but the fact remained that crayfish were all over the place. And they were cheap, actually, they were free. All you had to do was to go get them in the streams, and they were very nutritional, and poor people ate what we now pay a fortune for without paying a cent. So I will not go into interpretation of why the crayfish are there, but I can tell you that the literature is rather vast. Now, we were saying that the Last Supper was tormented by a number of problems and restorations and calamities and humidity. Napoleon turned the whole thing into a stable with horses, and there was even a flood. I mean, you name it, everything that could possibly happen happened to the Last Supper. But it's also the most, I should say, reproduced and Catalanized. I mean, it's a work of art. It ends. Never mind stamps, never mind postcards, never mind T-shirts, etc. But look at this lady. I mean, she was part of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus, and the whole body was tattooed. Nowadays, of course, everybody has got the whole body's tattooed. But at that time, she was an odd person. I mean, her body was rather odd to look at, and so she was a circus attraction with the Last Supper painted, tattooed on her back. Now, as I said, there are sometimes there was a last on the highway between Newark and Elizabethtown. I think there was a huge poster of the Last Supper. I mean, the Last Supper has been reproduced, badly reproduced, millions of times, and yet, contrary to what you would expect, contrary to the, we are so accustomed to seeing it that one would say, well, seen one, seen them all. Well, the actual sight of a good reproduction, of course, but the actual visit to the Last Supper makes your blood curdle to this day. I mean, all the praises that you read about, Stendhal, Goethe, Dickens, D'Annunzio, everyone goes there. So, the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's true. It's really a great emotional thing. It somehow defeats the notion that the mechanical reproduction of the work of art takes away the aura from the original. I know Benjamin's famous essay. We may want to think again about it, because I personally, for one, certainly felt the aura was still there after having seen all these reproductions. But even Kenneth Clark, a very famous scholar of Leonardo, says it's a miracle that after all this reproduction, we still feel an emotion when we see the real thing. Now, this I would say for the last, for the conclusion. So I go back to the notion, did Leonardo know that he was doing something that was contrary to, not only to custom, but to philology, Yes, he did know, because in the Codex Atlanticus is a set of pages. It's called Atlanticus not because it has anything to do with the Atlantic Ocean, but simply because the size of the page is what was used for geographical drawings, okay? And it's also one of the few things that the French did not steal from Milan when Napoleon went there, is the Codex Atlanticus. So you can still see it actually at the Ambrosiana Library, and it's beautiful because they show it page by page, and they keep changing them, okay? It's sort of difficult to read because, as you know, Leonardo had the habit of writing right from left rather than right, rather than left from right. But there are beautiful reproductions and made legible. And so, in any case, Leonardo had bought a Bible, paid 61 lira for it. This is a classic Leonardo, He says, today I invented a new landmine. I bought 2 pair of shoes, 10 liras, and so on and so forth. It's incredible, the amount of information that you get on the same page, and it is so varied and so incredibly dispersed, In any case, in one of the sheets of the Codex Atlanticus, we know that he bought a translation of the Bible into Italian. This is very important because for a while, the church allowed the Bible in Italian to circulate. Then they began to think that it was perhaps a little too dangerous. They took it out and only permitted the Latin version to circulate. Now, after the Council of Lateran, Pope John the 23rd said, no, let's go back to Italian, German, whatever. But for a long time, at least in Catholic countries, the only language in which you could read the Bible was Latin, in the translation of Jerome, St. Jerome. But, as I said, for a little while, it was available in Italian. Why is it important? Well, it's important because Leonardo only spoke and read Italian. It's interesting to see that an over genius was linguistically deprived, okay? He tried every once in a while to learn a little Latin, but it really didn't amount to much. In any case, he had this fortune that he knew he could read the Deuteronomy, Moses' book, and find out that he should not have painted the eel on the Last Supper. Now, however, he did. So, for a long time, eels were considered the tastiest of all fish. From antiquity, I'm talking about Plato mentions the eels as a delicacy. And Aristotle devotes a great number of pages to eels, trying to figure out how they reproduce, where they come from, and of course it's all bogus, but for now, but in these days, I mean, this fish was interesting. Homer didn't think he was a fish at all. He says fish and eels, you know, when he, in the Iliad and so on. So there are many recipes from antiquity all the way to the 17th century in which the eel is the predominant fish. Now, one could say, okay, so do we know anyone who liked fish, like eels very much? Yes, the Duke of Milan. He was fond, and his wife too. So, first thing you can think, now I understand. He put the table, you know, who was paying for the Last Supper? The Duke of Milan. Okay, so eels on the table. Not enough. Okay, you can say, well, maybe he liked it. Actually, he was a vegetarian. So, and we know for a fact that he was a vegetarian because he, at one point in the Codex Atlanticus that I spoke about before, writes that the body, the human being that eats meat, is like a sarcophagus. We are accepting a rotten body in our own body, okay? Twice. Not that he didn't buy meat, because he had a family of about 40 people to support. You know, he had people who ground the lapis lazuli and people who tried to fly off walls and so on. So, I mean, he had a large company to get. And sometimes in the Codex, you see, today I bought good beef, but not for himself. It's interesting that in 1516, that's more or less the year, that's the year of his death, a gentleman from Florence goes all the way to India, a traveler, I mean, you know, and he runs into a tribe of Indians, the Gujarat, and he writes back to Florence saying, guess what? Here, they're all like Leonardo, because they're all vegetarians, you know. An entire tribe, an entire group, ethnic group, does not eat meat, just like our Leonardo. So he was famous before his, as a vegetarian person. So one more reason why you could say perhaps you wanted to please with a very special delicacy people of some respect, like Jesus and the apostles. But that is also not tenable because they were observing Easter, Passover. Okay, so now, so if Leonardo's gastronomic concerns are not on the top of his list, as we know, and also his propensity to dress messages in a cryptic fashion begins to surface. I mean, the suspicion that he might have had used those eels to deliver a message which was not so clear immediately surfaces inevitably. You know, so why on earth? He doesn't eat eels. The Duke is never in his life has paid homage or you know, stooped down in front of the Duke. There must be something else here at work in the Last Supper. And yes, there is something else. But before we get to that, I want you to step back a little bit and consider that in the 1400s, a major cultural change had occurred in Europe concerning sins, and especially the two capital sins that open the list: gluttony and luxury, or luxury meaning sex, okay? The easiest one is gluttony, okay? So what do we do with it? You know, there are 7 deadly vices that take you directly to hell, right? One is ire, one is stinginess, and so on and so forth. But they're not necessarily Christian. I mean, nobody likes wrathful people, no matter what religion they belong to. But sex and food are the domain of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, what happens is that in 1417, mark this date, 1417, three major things occur. One is an ecumenical council. What is an ecumenical council? It's a gathering of cardinals, theologians, scholars, and they decide what to do or about certain issues that have come up. For instance, in Trent, in the 16th century, they decided a priest should not marry, period, and we know the outcome. But before they could, if they wanted to. Ecumenical Council decided that that was prohibited. Okay. Now, what happens in Constance, on the Lake of Constance, in now Switzerland? An ecumenical council. Why is it that they convened an ecumenical council? Very simple. There were three popes at the time, or three people who claimed to be popes. And the papacy was not in Rome, had not been in Rome for 100 years. They had moved to Avignon under the protection of the French king. But never before, three people said, I am the Pope. So we had to come to terms with this little problem. And after many deliberations, the three popes were swept away, the three would-be pope were swept away, and a new pope created, Martin V, and that was 1417. Now, why is this so important? Well, imagine the state of the city of Rome in 1417 after 100 years of abandonment. To begin with, don't forget that Rome, at the time of Augustus, so Roman times, housed 1 million people. At the time of Martin V, in 1417, there were 15,000. But the marble was there, all the buildings were there, the streets were there, and so on and so forth. So it's a major challenge for a pope to go back to Rome and rebuild the city. Martin is great. He just takes 2 years from Constance to Rome. It's not that far. I mean, today by train it's about 5 hours. But it took him 2 years sauntering down to Rome, and he stopped here and there. He stopped in Ferrara, he stopped in Mantua, stopped in Florence, and he picked up cardinals with money. He would just buy cardinals, or actually they would stipulate with the ruling families of very many cities that he would appoint one of their offspring as cardinals, provided that he, I was about to say or she, no, just he, would come with a purse big enough to rehab the section of Rome that he would be given. So the parish church, the bishop church, and the surrounding area. So every cardinal that he appointed, one of them was from Mantua, 17 years old, but with a lot of money, went to Rome, and as a matter of fact, Rome, in a matter of 50 years, began thriving again. Before that, the major city in Italy was Florence. And Florence was the capital of what we know as the Renaissance, the humanism, and so on, because something very interesting had happened. Namely, one family, especially the Medici family, with a very large purse, managed to attract to Florence intellectuals who knew Greek. Really, because they were Greek. They were from Greece, and they were being pushed out of what used to be the Eastern Roman Empire, whatever was left of it, by the Turks. The Turks were coming in. And in fact, they did conquer Constantinople and so on and so forth. So there was a cultural migration of intellectuals to Rome, to Italy, and especially to Florence, because that's where the money was. And they had an opportunity to teach Greek to the Italians, who eventually retranslated Aristotle into Latin, and for the first time they understood what the hell he was saying. So we have first a pope who goes to Rome, and by the way, 2 days after his after his accepting the hard task of being a pope, he hires a cook. Johann of Bockenheim, who eventually wrote a rather mischievous cookbook in which he has a number of recipes. That's what he was serving in Rome, the papacy, the curate. He has a number of recipes, and at the end of each recipe, he has who the recipe is for. Either a nation or a trade, a job, a type of profession. So you have, this is good for Germans, this is good for soldiers in the field, this is good for Tuscans, and so on. And there is one that says, this is good for whores. So, okay, and it's a great recipe. I mean, you understand that these poor people were eating sponges. Yeah, nowadays we use a sponge to brush your body with, but sponge is actually a vegetable. You know, what we see is yellow because it's dry, but you can actually eat a real sponge. And in fact, Boiron, the homeopathic company, continues to make the sponge austa, and that's because it wets your throat. Now, I don't draw any conclusion, but Eris bonum pro meretricibus, written by a cook working for cardinals and popes, and throat. There's some connection there. I will not belabor my point. Okay? So, in any case, hiring a cook and making a point of it, you know, it's interesting because it means that the Pope liked to eat, after all, you know, and he began to think that perhaps you could be a little lighter on the issue of gastronomy and sin number one. But as I said, this migration, this cultural migration, something by far more important occurs. One of the people who attended the Council of Constance, Poggio Bracciolini, a very important humanist, discovers the manuscript of Lucretius de Rerum Natura. Now, this is a poem written in the 1st century AD, and it's a hymn to the philosophy of Epicurus. Who is Epicurus? Well, he was a very well-known Greek philosopher from antiquity, who in the Middle Ages had been really bad-mouthed to an incredible degree. He was turned into a lecher, into a glutton, into an atheist, and so on. And now, for the first time, someone is reading a poem in which he appears completely different. A gentleman who recommends moderation, and he says, of course, pleasure, as long as it's not hurtful. Pleasure is necessary to happiness. If you're not pleased with what you do, you'll never achieve happiness. All right, but Epicure, now we still use the word Epicurean, as if you were a glutton, but, or in any case, a hedonist, you know, someone who likes to la bonne chère and so on. But okay, so we have a pope, who is going to be a little softer on the issue of gluttony. Now we have the discovery of a manuscript that says, okay, look, pleasure is all right after all. But lo and behold, all those people who've come from Constantinople and that taught Greek to the Italians have given them a chance to retranslate Aristotle's Ethics. And for the first time, they are not translating word by word, but ad sententiam. They are translating sentence by sentence. And what do they read? Pleasure is okay. Necessary, says Aristotle. Again, the same kind of reasoning that Epicurus had, except that Aristotle had been the base of theology during the Middle Ages. Epicurus was condemned. That puts him in hell. But Aristotle is a problem. What do we do now that Aristotle says it's okay and we said it wasn't okay? They wrote tracts and essays saying the contempt on pleasure and so on. And so now we have to adjust our perspective here. It takes about 50 years. At the end of the 1400s, a humanist who is actually the first librarian of the Vatican Library, Platina, writes a cookbook, and he calls it De Honesta Voluptate, on honest pleasure. Now you understand that putting together honesty and pleasure is a stroke of genius, because before, pleasure was anything but honest. Now, we are now coming to appreciate why painters in the 1400s began to put food on the table, because it's all right to eat. And Christ is eating. We eat the same thing that he does. And so do his apostle. So there is never mind whether he was a God and a man at the same time. Never mind he was one of three or three of one. He's eating what we eat. Now, if you are a preacher and you're up there in the pulpit and you have to make your audience feel good about it, probably people who did not eat very much for a long time, you would say, look, from now on, it's all right. We can go to heaven and eat whatever we want. And so, little by little, food appears. Never mind the bread and wine, which sometimes is there, sometimes is not even there. Never mind the cherries and the apricots and whatever. But real food, fish, fowls, meat. In Denmark, in Elsinore, the very famous town of Hamlet, there's a church with a Last Supper with a pig, actually a wild pig with fangs right on the table. So you can't contain it anymore. I mean, everywhere and so on. But as I said, and I guess I should actually go towards the conclusion of our talk. Now that we know that pleasure is necessary, now that we know that you can indulge to a certain extent, and in fact, the justification is really subtle. If you are created in God's image and likeness, assuming you assume that a certain spark of intelligence has come to you too, right? I mean, God is most intelligent. Maybe we're just a little intelligent and sophisticated. So if we are not taking advantage of the gifts of intelligence and taste and refinement that God has given us, we are really offending him. This is the way in which they turn the table around. First, if you eat too much or at all or prohibited food, you know where to go. You know where you will go. Pleasure is out because the real pleasure is in the hereafter. Now you can have pleasure here and happiness in the hereafter, because if you don't do it, you're offending God, who has given you the tools. I mean, I summarize it in a rather brutal fashion, but it took them 50 years to turn things around, okay? The Stoics and the Epicureans debated, dialogued, and of course they were all working for the Pope. Most of them were working, so they had to be careful. They couldn't just come out and say, look, that's bullshit, we have to do course. No, they had to, and that's why it took so long, because there were several popes that presided over this change. But the fact is that at the end of the 1400s, that change has occurred. Everyone is convinced that eating is fine, and that Jesus and the apostles would not object to our diet. Okay. Now, it's so important to realize, though, that Leonardo took advantage of this. We know for a fact that on the table of the Last Supper, there was more than just eels. There were fish, fowls, etc. You can see remnants of it, but it's not. It's just difficult. But if you really look carefully, you see them, and certainly you see the eels because of the way in which they are cut, and because next to each section there is a slice of orange. The recipe followed by Leonardo is eels roasted on a spit, and then when you put them on a plate, you actually squeeze orange or citrus fruit. That's one of the recipes, and that's the one he adopted. Also, very tenuously, you see the bone structure of the fish still, because Leonardo was very particular, And so, let's say we are 99% sure that those are eels. There's always a possibility that they are complete fool and they are not, but that's okay. Now, so if the question arises that all this is nice and dandy, but Leonardo was not interested in food, so was he interested in? And now we come to the speculative hypothesis that I propose. Now imagine, I owe this way of approaching paintings to a very simpatico art critic called Daniel Arras. Daniel Arras wrote many essays in which he said, yes, of course, cherries are the symbol of blood, blah, 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 but after we have done all this beautiful recognition and identification, how do we enjoy the painting? And he suggests that we first look at it. He does a beautiful analysis of Cossa's Annunciation. There is the angel Gabriel, Virgin Mary standing, and there's God the Father, the Holy Ghost, which is usually a white dove, blah, 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 and everything is in order. And then Daniel Arras notices that at the bottom of the painting, there's a huge snail. What is a snail doing in the Annunciation? And then humorously he says, I don't know what is that, but when was the promise of redemption made? In Genesis, God says, I will send a Redeemer, and there will be a woman who replaces Eve, and eventually give birth to God, and so on. That was a long time ago. How long did it take for that Redeemer to come to earth? A snail time. It takes forever to move. And so humorously, Cossa, according to Daniel Arras, put the snail there and say, well, you have to be patient. Eventually, the snail reaches you. Now, on this assumption, I said, let's go back to the Last Supper and take a look at it. Okay, whatever is available. Now, there's the text, which is, of course, the Last Supper itself. And then there's what we may call the paratext. I think we got to the end of this, right? Yes, so what I want you to look at is at these two images. I'm sorry, I was a little funny. I decided to turn it around in a Leonardian fashion, but it says, what is left of Duke Ludovico's coat of arms, originally placed above the actual painting of the Last Supper. And you can hardly see it because it's very minimally visible. It's a snake. Dante calls it a viper. A stylized version of it you can see on the right-hand side. It's a dragon with a baby in his mouth. It's a symbol of the city of Milan. To this day, if you follow Italian soccer, you know that there's a club called Inter, I-N-T-E-R, and that's what they have on their jersey. It's even Berlusconi used it for his media company. I mean, if you go to Milan, you can see this to this day, ancient and new versions of this snake serpent with a baby in it. Now, the reason why the baby is there is very simple. The dragon, the snake, had eaten one, and when his father comes back from the crusade, he said, "Where is so and so?" And my mama says, "Well, been eaten by a dragon." Where is the dragon? He says, "Well, he's in a lake not too far from Lodi, which is a town south of Milan. So I'll take care of it." He goes 2 years after the departure, the meal. He goes there, slaughters the dragon, and pulls out the baby from his mouth. This is the beautiful legend, of course, but it ended up as a coat of arms of the Visconti family, which preceded the Sforza family. And the Sforza family, one of them, Ludovico, paid for the Last Supper, decided not to erase the coat of arms of the previous family because they were really not legitimate descendants of them. So they thought, well, we can adopt their coat of arms, and maybe that reinforces our, helps us in establishing some legitimacy, okay? But the dragon is, of course, an emblem of strength, of power, of fear. It's not impossible for Ludovico, that's the name of the Duke who paid for the Last Supper, to say, well, we Sforza family have a stupid little coat of arms. It's a rampant lion. Brush that aside. Let's adopt a really sensational one. It's very rare. I mean, normally not very many people can boast of a dragon with a child in its mouth as a coat of arms, and so and make it stick. So Ludovico really made a publicity campaign. He put dragons everywhere, including one on top, outside the actual painting. That's why I call it paratextual. If the painting is textual, this is paratextual. It's around. But sometimes the information that the paratext gives you is as important, if not more important, than what's in the text. So, if you look at the painting and you come down directly from the dragon on the table, you see eels. Now, there's a major difference between being a dragon and being an eel. Dragons can be fought, killed, etc., but they're also very powerful. Instead, eels are slippery. You cannot hold them. Actually, Erasmus of Rotterdam, in one of his lesser-known essays, suggests that if you really want to get a hold of an eel, you should first equip yourself with a fig leaf. And then you can grab it and hold it, because a fig leaf, I guess it has a clutch that your bare hand doesn't have. Now, eels are slippery, are vicious. I know they taste good, but there is a whole literature, emblematic literature, indicating that if you call a person an eel, you're not paying him a compliment. Okay, because it means that he's a slippery son of a bitch, and he cannot be held to any position. He promises one thing, he doesn't do it. Now, go back to the Codex Atlanticus, and you find drafts of letters by poor Leonardo saying, could you please pay? I have 40 people to support. The Duke was promising and promising and promising and never delivering. The very last note of Leonardo leaving Milan after the downfall of Ludovico says, and nothing could be attained for him. In other words, nothing could be completed for him. We always think of Leonardo as someone who gets tired of what he's doing, moves on from one project to another. But in reality, he was yanked away all the time. He was doing some A, and he was asked to do B. He was doing B, he was asked to do C, etc., etc. So all this cluster of implications made me think that the eel is a direct response to the emblem of power that Ludovico put on the outside of the Last Supper. And who was looking at it? Ludovico, because Ludovico Sforza, that's the name of the patron, was a frequent guest of the monks in the refectory where the Last Supper is painted. And monks used to have very lean tables on the side walls, but the prior and his guest were always eating by looking at the apostle and the Lord eating their supper. So it's interesting that this idea of painting Last Suppers in refectories is because is the place where monks actually ate. And the idea was to eat in spiritual community with the Lord and his disciples. So I think that plausible or not plausible, I think it's plausible, but this is the only offer I could come up, the only idea I could come up with. And it seems to me that knowing the relationship between Leonardo and his patron, it's a very plausible one. And I thank you very much for having listened to all this. Naturally, if there are questions, I'll be very happy to answer if I can. Yes?
Have you seen the piece yourself?
I'm sorry, you have to speak a little louder because I'm a little deaf.
Have you seen the original?
Can you repeat it again?
Have you seen the original?
Have you seen The Last Supper?
Oh, many times, yes. That's why I finally decided that I saw what was above the Last Supper. And actually, that was only not too long ago because everyone, the issue of eels has never been dealt with in any form, except that someone has identified the dish on the table, and that was it. So the Last Supper, you have to make a reservation. But I'll tell you what, if you happen to be in Milan and it's early in the morning, they'll let you sleep in. But you can't stand more than 15 minutes. That's maximum, because one of the reasons why this Last Supper deteriorated is because of the temperature. And if you let 100 people into the room, the temperature changes. Now it's very well calibrated, everything has been restored, etc. And I must say that Olivetti paid for the entire restoration and weather adjustment. Yes?
What was your first experience like to visit the Last Supper for the first time?
My first experience?
Yeah. With visiting it.
Oh, my first experience was so long ago, and at that time, the paint, what we see nowadays is not what I saw 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Because at that time, the Last Supper had been repainted. Mind you that you see, well, let's go back. Judas, here we go. Judas is in right here. I don't know if you can see it. It's in a very awkward position, right? It's, or you can actually enlarge it. Don't tell me. Wow.
That's at least somewhat better.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's this guy. This fellow here. Can we move that? No.
No.
No. Okay. All right.
That might be
That's all right.
yeah.
But Judas is what technically is called profil perdu, lost profile, because he's turned around. Now the restorer could not do it, so they replaced, and you could see Judas looking at you rather than at Christ, or scantily looking at Christ. So what we saw a long time ago was not Leonardo's anymore, and because it was by far more visible, but it wasn't his because it had been painted over and over again. So the last restoration was actually a way of taking away all the things that had been encrusted upon it. And as I said, despite the fact that we only see 30% of what the maestro painted, it's still an incredible experience. Yes?
Well, why, in your opinion, what makes the Vinci's rendition the most long-lasting and most famous?
Oh, it's not my opinion. It's everywhere. I mean, it's been there since 1498, and well, there are others, but they seem to. There are others, of course. Strangely enough, another one is by Leonardo, Mona Lisa. There are. I'm not saying that Leonardo meant a particular that he had envisaged the lasting of. As a matter of fact, he was a fool. He painted on a northern wall full of humidity. The monks had their kitchen on the other side. At one point, they even broke the wall. I mean, they were supposed to be the guardian of the masterpiece, right? And look at this. You see, you don't see the feet of Christ because in the 1700 they just broke. They felt that it was a little uncomfortable to bring the dishes from the kitchen into the refectory because the door was a little narrow, so they made a huge door. Imagine the amount of hammering that went in there and how much of the pigmentation was lost. All I'm saying is that despite all this, it's still. And imagine the building was bombed and so on and so on. Despite all these calamities, it's still breathtaking. The reason why it's so famous, it's perhaps also because of surviving, because it survived so many calamities. But it is true that together with a handful of others, I mean, Andy Warhol would probably be the next one. As a matter of fact, the last piece by Andy Warhol was the reproduction of the Last Supper, the last work. And this was in the 80s, I believe, in Milan. He produced 60 Last Suppers, and the Eels were there, okay, very clearly. I'm sorry, there was a question back there. No? Yes. As I said, I'm a little deaf, so you have to speak up.
Let's say you got commissioned to make the Last Supper. What would you put on the table?
What would I? Very good question. I tell you what I would put on the table. But don't tell anyone else except you. I would put on a table a Tex-Mex soup that my wife makes beautifully. It's, you know, it's a what do you call chicken and tortilla. I could eat myself to death. Yes.
Just you mentioned crayfish as being really prominent and
Yes.
or easy to find. Were eels also like
Absolutely.
in the rivers? Like
Yes,
Tiber, can you
everywhere,
get eels
yes.
in the Tiber?
Yes, actually, even in the canals, I mean, eels are funny creatures. Only recently, about 100 years ago, we figured out where they come from and what they do. They come from the Sea of Sargasso. The Sargasso Sea is in the Gulf of Mexico, more or less, Bermudas actually. And it's a huge section of the Atlantic covered with a kind of algae, right? They come from there. There's the Atlantic. The Pacific we don't know yet, but the Atlantic eel is born there, except that it's a little tiny leaf, like an olive leaf, transparent, and the Gulf Stream brings it to Europe, and the Northern Stream brings it up to North America. Okay, it takes about 3 years for these little things to come to Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and so on. And by the time they get there, they are this long and they are blind. They're called blind, chicken. Then they enter the Mediterranean or the Baltic Sea. They enter the rivers because they switch from salt water to fresh water. And they live there for as long as they wish. 20, 30, 40. They monitored one that was 40 or 50 years old. And without knowing why, at one point they go back to the Sea of Sargasso to reproduce. God knows why it takes them, by now they're long eels, it takes them only 6 months to go back. They're rather fat, they don't eat anything for 6 months, they go back and they disappear. No one has ever seen an eel copulating. No one. So we don't really know what happens down there, but, well, we can figure it out. It's interesting because we only know that that's where they come from because someone spent about 30 years of his life canvassing the Atlantic and finding smaller and smaller and smaller sample of this Leptocephalus, as it was called. And then in Messina, in Sicily, someone had a fluke. By a fluke, he could, in captivity, one of these damn things turned into an eel. So they made a connection because for a long time they never connected the Leptocephalus with the eel. But it's a very intriguing fish. Now, the crayfish, interestingly, is the eels, as I said, it's the only person who ever thought. Perhaps I forgot to say that the only painter who put eels on the table was Leonardo. Everyone else put all kinds of food in, so did he, but he's the only one who put the eel, and that's why I thought to make the connection with the dragon. But the crayfish, also, by the way, today in Italy, to eat crayfish, you have to pay a fortune because they've all been exterminated by a smart aleck who brought in an American crayfish in the 1800s, and they were the American, one of the American, many kinds of crayfish, of course, but it was not compatible with the environment, and pretty soon it was devastated the fauna in Europe. Then, of course, chemicals, blah blah blah. So by now, if you find a crayfish, you're a lucky person, or you have to go to special places where you pay a fortune for it. But in those days, they were all over the place, and eels too. Now, when it comes to painting, though, strangely enough, well, eel is only Leonardo, but crayfish are painted in out-of-the-way churches in the mountains, in the hills, in one very specific area, from the Ticino River to the Piave River. So let's say in northern Italy, above the Po River, below the Alps, and that's the only area where there are hundreds of little churches out of the way with frescoes of Last Suppers with crayfish on it. It's only in the province of Belluno Treviso. I mean, you can come, but there are so many churches, and most of them are just fragments. But some of them are very well kept, actually. I showed you one in which they are very visible. But the idea of fish, we don't realize this, but fish was really a big staple throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the Renaissance. And I don't know if you're familiar with more or less, if you can picture the situation in northern Italy. There are several lakes, rather large lakes and rivers that cross the valley of the Po River Valley. And for a long time, anyone could just get crayfish and eels out of them without much fatigue. You just had to pick them up. And interesting. That's why I think one of the reasons why in that particular area, the painters who were itinerant painters, they repeated the same thing over and over again. Just painted what was available there, and the mountaineers and the contadini were eating. But leave it to intellectuals, they have to find a reason for it, which is not gastronomic, as I did with the eels. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned that
I'll come close.
you mentioned that eels, they have stereotypes of vicious, evil, sly. Where do these come from? And are they hinting characters?
Sure. Okay. Now, why is the eel considered a vicious animal? And there are, well, to begin with, I take you back a few centuries. Okay. In the 4th century A.D., the bishop of Milan was called Ambrose, Saint Ambrose. There are some restaurants in town called Sant'Ambrose. That's Milanese for Ambrose. Okay, and he is possibly the first one to identify the eel as a fish that there are also sea fish, sea eels, not just freshwater eels. To identify that particular fish with a copulating with a viper, with a snake. It's another legend. Okay, so you have possibly there are other writers that do that, but that I've read myself. So Saint Ambrose says that vipers and eels copulate. Now, of course, it just doesn't stop there. It tells you what is the meaning. And the meaning is really ungracious, because he continues, he says that the viper, being the male element in the couple, before copulating, spits out the poison and then unites itself with the fish, with the eel. And isn't that nice? St. Ambrose says, how delicate for a husband to do that to his wife. So, to begin with, he assumes that eels could be mistreated, except that in some cases like this, they are not. But from this, a whole series, a whole lot of literature emerges in which vipers do not behave so clearly, so well, so gently with the eels. And at this point, you can find justifications for it. He says, well, of course, your husband is a drunkard, he smokes, he's unfaithful, but poor thing, he's a man. You have to put up with it. You are a good wife. You have, and so on and so on. It's very, very anti-feminist here. So you have that to begin with. Second, there are books called emblemata, that is to say, vignettes. I think we saw one before. I guess I didn't bring one, but in any case, you can imagine this. Sometimes a drawing of an eel, and then a rhyme, usually couplets, maybe 5 or 6 lines, in which they describe the quality of the eel, that is to say, slimy, difficult to be held, untrustworthy, etc., etc. And there is a whole literature. One, unfortunately, the most famous one is called Alciati, but it's called the Emblemata, and it's in Latin anyway, in which the eel is depicted as an animal that cannot be trusted. It has nothing to do with food. So I believe that Leonardo was also acquainted with that type of literature. And in the book I do mention this. I devote quite a number of pages to this fact, to this connection between Leonardo and the books of emblems. So that's why I think it's justifiable to make the connection with the dragon. Yes? No? Okay.
Sorry.